Coming up on the Pete Sousa Show on the Rogue Sports Network. It's a bit of a tragic podcast. Shakespearean tragedy. We're talking about O.J. Simpson. We talk about Pete Rose. Keith O'Brien, New York Times bestselling author who just wrote a book, Charlie Hustle, about Pete Rose, is going to talk to us about, another guy who had a huge fall from grace. Also, the host of the Ball Don't Lie podcast and the book called Built to Lose. It's about tanking in the NBA. We got Jake Fischer. And, of course, we got Zach Burke standing by. It's weird. I didn't know that we were kind of tragic until we started talking about it here. We got Mike Hamilton in the room and, of course, my man Zach Burke. So that's all coming right up. Don't go anywhere. Zach Burke joins me as we get set to start another week of the Pete Sousa Show, which, of course, will become daily. I shouldn't say, of course, which will become daily. Should I look at Zach? I got to look this way, right?
Yeah, you can if you want to. I mean,
yeah, I don't know if I want to.
You can address the people. You can address the people.
You guys can see Zach, right? I mean, we're not exactly talking to Pam Anderson over here.
Well,
but you're not exactly looking at Pam Anderson either, so it's all good. So, a couple things I wanted to talk to you about today.
Yes.
Of course, we're going to talk about the Pete Rose book with Keith O'Brien, and we're going to talk about the NBA with Jake Fischer and his podcast, Ball Don't Lie, and, of course, his book about tanking. First thing I wanted to discuss, though, O.J. Simpson passed away last week, and he passed away after we taped our podcast, so I didn't get much of a chance to talk about him. I don't know. This says something about me. I have been, and I have to use this word, sort of obsessed with O.J. Simpson, not just the trial, but the person he was, how just he was. I tell young people today that, I work with over at the news station, KWTX, they'll ask, what about O.J. Simpson? Like, who was he? People don't even know. And it would almost be like we were talking about John Cena before we started the show. It would almost be like, but a bigger star than John Cena. It would almost be like if Charles Barkley maybe was accused of a double murder and all of a sudden was on the run from police in the middle of the Super Bowl, or in this case, the NBA Finals. I mean, that is hard to wrap your mind around. And I've watched anybody that wants to know a little more about the O.J. Simpson situation, because there's such a newsworthy piece of this when you think about race in South Central Los Angeles leading up to, obviously, the O.J. trial, the resentment from the black community towards the justice system, and why that was very much an earned resentment or a justified resentment, and how that played into the ultimate O.J. verdict. And, two things can be true at once, right? O.J. could have quite possibly killed two people, and it's quite possible, or probably, not even probably, it's very true that there was not much fairness in that justice system back, especially in South Central L.A., in the underprivileged areas back in, like I said, leading up to that trial. But the craziest part about it, what was I was talking about? O.J. Simpson, American Tragedy. That is the documentary. Have you seen that, Zach?
Yes, I have.
Don't lie. Have you seen it? It's a 5 episodes. It's 2 hours.
I haven't seen all of it. I have seen but it's good. What I've watched, it's really good.
Now this is another thing about me, which I feel like sometimes I'm regressing. I think I've watched it way too many times but that's not necessarily a rewatchable. But
yeah, see, I rewatch things like Community, but okay, a documentary on OJ. But there's nothing wrong with it, though.
We could have. I see a psychologist or a psychiatrist. She can probably talk. I could probably talk to her about why I watch that over and over again. But it really reminds me of, I guess, my childhood and just for me, I had a really good childhood. So growing up, maybe it reminds me of a good time, but obviously not a good time for America and for O.J. Simpson, and of course, first and foremost, the two people who were murdered. Nicole Brown Simpson and Ron Goldman. The most captivating part about this situation for me was that chase back in July 17th, I'm pretty sure it was, 1994. And if you want to get inside baseball on this thing, the NBA Finals were being broadcast on NBC when this chase starts. O.J. Simpson worked for NBC as a football analyst. He, by the way, one of the more interesting stories, he was the first black man hired on Monday Night Football. That was ABC's number one football show, obviously, the number one football show in the land in 1983. They took him off the air. By 1984, he had worn out his welcome. And this has never been done since. I want you to imagine this now as we get off track a little bit. OJ was supposed to be on the Super Bowl broadcast. So this would be like you're going into a Super Bowl, and who's going to call the game? Jim Nantz and Tony Romo. No, wait a minute. We're going to take Tony Romo off, and we're going to replace him with Pat Mahomes.
Yeah.
Like that happened to OJ, which was weird. That was like just something that nobody ever talks about. That did happen to him.
Like, so he had the Super Bowl kind of taken away from him then?
Absolutely, 100%. And that was when he was with ABC. Then he transitioned to NBC. So he's working at NBC, and he's more of an analyst. When they have live studio shows, he would be live at the game, a pregame show, or he was mostly live in studio with Bob Costas. I remember, I don't know if he was a sideline reporter. He was a sideline reporter for the Super Bowl in Atlanta, Dallas, and Buffalo, the second one, where, again, Dallas won. So this is a guy who was an institution on the field. I mean, he gained more than 2,000 yards on the field in 1972. To imagine that, and somebody did the math. I think Mike Florio, I was listening to, did the math. That would be like running for, with the 17 games now, forgive me with the math, but it would be like running for 2,500 yards or 2,600 yards.
Yeah.
In the NFL.
Yeah.
So that's how amazing he was as a player. So this chase is going on. Bob Costas, who works with O.J. Simpson, he hosts a studio show with him, is now on the air, not calling the game, but he's the pregame show, postgame, halftime show, the host for NBC. He is now cutting in and out of coverage, talking to Marv Albert, who obviously knows O.J., but not as well as Bob Costas. Their boss, Dick Ebersol, who was the president of NBC Sports at the time, is very close with OJ. So now Dick Ebersol has to decide, what are we going to do? Are we going to keep the game on? Or like every other network, are we going to show the chase? And Bob Costas was on the Today Show this week, and I wanted to play his memory of the chase. Go ahead, take it away, Zach.
Well, NBC was in a unique position. Every other network, every cable entity went live and carried it for hours upon hours. But we had not just a basketball game, an NBA Finals game involving the number one market in the country, not incidentally, the New York Knicks against the Houston Rockets. The series was tied 2-2. Game 5 was a close game. And so Dick Ebersol of NBC Sports and the people at NBC News had to make a decision. And throughout that evening, Marv Albert was calling the game. Sometimes he'd throw it to me. I would then transition to Tom Brokaw, who was at 30 Rock. He would summarize the situation, which he called a Shakespearean tragedy, and it certainly fit that description, and then I'd send it back to Marv Albert. And other times, we'd split the screen. So Ewing and Olajuwon would be going at it at Madison Square Garden, and the Bronco would be making its way slowly down the 405 on the other side of the screen. It was surreal, to put it mildly.
So Costas sets the stage. What he doesn't tell you is the story where O.J. Simpson is in the Bronco with Al Cowlings, his former Buffalo Bills teammate and forever, like, best buddy. And O.J., they call NBC, they call the switchboard so OJ can talk to Bob Costas. And as Costas tells the story, this was later told to Costas by Al Cowlings. OJ, not Bo Jackson, OJ wanted to get in touch with Bob Costas to kind of use him as a character reference. Like, people are being defamatory speaking about me on television. Not necessarily like, hey, I'm innocent. Not even that. He wanted Costas to serve as a character reference. The person who answered the phone at the switchboard thought that it wasn't OJ. So they hung up on the guy.
Yeah.
He was like, this is O.J. Simpson. I'm in the car.
He's like, yeah, right. And then,
Yeah. So that is just like a little wrinkle into 95 million people watch that chase. That's close to a Super Bowl, almost. That's basically is a Super Bowl. When you think about that, where were you, Zach?
So I was, for the chase itself,
I've been looking at you. You've been like a tag team wrestler, going up and down, outside the ring, stomping his foot, waiting to tag in. Yeah.
But no, I was 5, almost 6, and I remember that I lived with my grandparents for a bit, and we watched like the chase. And even as a 5-year-old, not knowing like who or what exactly was going on, still being just absolutely captivated while it was showing it, because it was big enough to where my grandparents had stopped whatever they were watching to sit there and focus fully on it. And then it was one of those things of where even at a young age, they're not showing us this basketball game. They're focusing more on this. Like, there has to be something to it. And then that, and then leading into like the court case afterwards too, I would come home from school and my grandma would have it on all day long. So it was something that even as a little kid, that while I didn't necessarily understand just the whole scope of it, it was something that even as a young one, I was like, okay, this is a part of like, you know, what's going on for the world right now, or at least for our nation right now. And it was weird that even as a 5 or 6 year old being able to try to process and be like, all right, this is something that I'm kind of, you know, following in a way too.
Yeah, and following OJ even after that was something surreal. Like Costas just said. By the way, Bob Costas is like
Great.
Oh my gosh, that Bob Costas talking about anything is pure joy for me.
For sure.
He's been one of those magical players in your life, you know, all the way back since I was a kid. I'll tell you another magical guy. Is now a team member of ours at the Rogue Media Network is King McClure.
Yeah.
King McClure has a podcast up here, a show, the King McClure Show. Mm-hmm. King and I have been able to work games together at ESPN. King had been on my radar for a long time. I mean, he was obviously a standout at Baylor, and he quickly became one of my favorite color analysts at ESPN because not only is he so bright, but he's himself, and he's not that far removed from the game, so he has such a fresh take on stuff. And I wouldn't ever want to say that King, he just is fully himself. Mm-hmm. I would never want to use the phrase he doesn't care, because he does care. I mean, what people think. I mean, we all do. But he is an amazing color analyst. And to have him, an amazing dude, I call him a buddy. Like, we got to work together several times this year. We got to hang out. So anyways, you would understand my emotional turmoil, or maybe you wouldn't, when I'm coming up here today to tape the interview. We do tape things before the show sometimes. To tape the interview with Keith O'Brien, I'm so excited. I'm almost like walking up the stairs with like my briefcase. You know, I'm like, da-da-da. I'm on time. I've done all the research. I was literally on the Cameron Park Trail listening to more about the Pete Rose book. I have all my questions, you know, written out.
You're ready
Keith.
to go.
I'm ready, and I'm so excited. You and Mike sent me pictures of this beautiful studio.
We got it all. It looks
I am
nice
like,
out.
it looks amazing. You guys have done a tremendous job. I mean, I can't even begin. We won't even get into that because it's too corny. Nobody wants to see that. But anyways, let's get to the reality. I walk up, and all of a sudden, King has an amazing voice. Mm-hmm. And all the doors are shut. And as I get close to this studio, I hear King's voice. I'm like, wait a minute. And then I remember I was on a text thread yesterday. It said King was going to be here at 10:30. I mean, Mike Hamilton, who I'll call the director of operations, might as well have walked out in the hallway and kicked me in the balls, swift and hard.
You want me to give you another background part of that? Is when you text us.
I don't know if I do. Go ahead.
Okay, well then, I mean,
no,
if you
tell me.
So we're in here, like while King's
recording. And I say 2 minutes away.
Yeah, 2 minutes away. And Mike looks at me and goes, I'll deal with that. And gets up in.
Yeah, he dealt with it.
But yeah.
I've always told Mike that he is the kind of guy that he's great with talent. Mm-hmm. I don't know if that's what you call me. That's what you call King. But he's great with managing talent. I always see Mike. There was a guy named Doc something, and he was the manager for Motley Crue. Mm-hmm. And other major rock bands. I could see Mike doing that, like getting the guy, like totally dealing with like just constantly putting Band-Aids on bullet holes and cleaning up messes. He's Mike's a special guy like that. He's got a real knack for handling shit. You know,
for sure, sure. That is a great way to describe Mike.
Yeah. So I came up here, and then it took me. So then I go into the other. Now I'm in an alternate studio, right? And which is great. I mean, any studio I'm in, I should be so grateful. But I'm like, you know. But then now it's time to do an interview with Keith. So I'm like, all right, let's go. Let's get locked in. And quickly that took. And I knew, by the way, from the work I've done on myself, like, get out of yourself. You know, I got an ego. I'm not perfect. I was like, for a second or two, I was like jammed, and then I was like, just let, you know, who cares? Like, and then, you know, it's in life we start to you get these moments where we all get like bent out of shape, and it's like, what do you do with it? So I chose to throw like a tantrum without talking, where Mike would have to ask me how I was doing, and I could tell him I was doing okay, and I could be honest with him. I said, well, this isn't Yeah, but
Yeah.
so that's it.
No, No, it was. I can see why.
No, don't say why. There's no reason
Okay.
why. Let me tell you
I
the
won't
truth.
fine. I won't.
There's
justify
no
it for
reason
you
why I
then.
should have been
Okay.
upset. I really believe that. Like,
Okay.
as somebody who is, I like to think I'm somewhat evolved. Like, it's no big deal at all. And so I had to get right sized about it. But I was upset that King didn't stick around to say hello to
He
me.
just
Yeah,
bounced.
because he knows what's good for him. He hit the road.
Oh.
Maybe he was out of there.
Oh, okay.
No, I did say the next time that happens, he better, even if he's here, he better stick around.
Yeah, we could have talked to him.
What do you? But by the way, what do you think about his show so far?
Great. I loved it. The show that we did or that we recorded today it was really good. It was really good.
King is a rising star, not only in life but as an analyst at ESPN. I don't even know if you can call him rising anymore. I mean, look, the dude did like early in the season. You know, I connected with King and we were talking a little bit, chatting before, just online before we had called a couple games together. I think we ended up doing 3 or 4 this year, and I was like, I liked his work. Right, all of a sudden you turn on the TV, and now the season is starting, and he's in the studio in Bristol. I mean, as a college basketball analyst, and then they use him as much as they can on games, and then after the year, the Big 12 is the best conference in college basketball. King is live at the Big 12 tournament, analyzing the Big 12 on ESPN. And I always tell people this when people are asking me, like, hey, man, when are you going to be doing Fox NFL?
Yeah.
Like, there's only so many chairs.
Yeah.
And, of course, that's like we all dare to dream. But the reality is it's a numbers game in life. And, whether you're an analyst at ESPN or whether you want to be a CEO at Merck. I don't even know if that's a company anymore, but that's, there's only so many jobs.
For sure.
And King has, in a short period of time, earned his way into some of the biggest chairs in college sports right now. It's pretty impressive.
No, very impressive. Very impressive. And listening to the guy talk, like he knows what he's talking about too.
There is no doubt. And the thing about King that's super cool too is he's also, if you follow him online, like he's very real. He'll get very honest with people, and it's just there's a connection there that you have. I was listening to, it's the last thing I'll say, and then we'll get to Keith O'Brien. I was listening to The Press Box, is a podcast on The Ringer, and Brian Curtis is the host of the show. And he talked about his conversation with Vern Lundquist. And Vern Lundquist told Curtis in an interview they did years ago, you can tell, he said, I think people can tell when the broadcasters are assholes. Vern said that. And when you watch King, I think you can tell he's such an awesome dude. It's the opposite of that.
Oh, for sure. No, for sure. There's guys that you can just kind of, they have a sense about it when you watch, when you're like, yeah, I get that feeling. You don't have it at all with him.
Yeah. All right. You got a good feeling now?
I have a really good feeling.
Keith O'Brien coming up. Keith O'Brien, the book is Charlie Hustle, and the book is phenomenal so far. I grew up a Pete Rose fan because I'm from Philadelphia. Similar story for you. You're from Cincinnati. Grew up a diehard Reds fan. Was this book hard for you to write from an emotional standpoint?
So it was definitely difficult to write for a couple of reasons. One, this is the first book I've ever written where the people in the room, the people in the dugout, the people who were eyewitnesses or part of the same discussion have completely opposite memories of how it goes down. So that's number one. I'm threading a narrative needle here all the time with some of these stories because, let's just say Pete Rose has one version of events and the investigators have another version of events and the whistleblower has a third version. So that was tricky, number one. Number two, yeah, I mean, obviously, as I note in the author's note at the front of the book, I sort of lived this story as a kid, as a teenager, as a baseball fan. I'm born and raised in Cincinnati. I had a Pete Rose poster on my wall as a kid, like almost everybody in Cincinnati did in the 1980s. So, so that was tricky, at times. And I will say that, while this book is no different than any other book I've ever written. This is narrative nonfiction. I'm not part of it. There's no first person. There's no me. There's no I. It is a personal story, for all those reasons. Because I'm from Cincinnati, and I know what that felt like. And so, what I tried to do was let the emotions inform my reporting. And by that, I mean, I know exactly how it felt in 1985 on the night when Pete Rose set the all time hit record. I remember exactly where I was standing. Again, none of that's part of the book, but I let those emotions, which I still feel as a fan, inform the writing of that, that part of the book, that chapter of the book. Same with, say, The Fall in 1989. Pete Rose initially gets, the rumors of his troubles, gambling troubles, in late February 1989. By March 1989, it's clear there's going to be a major league investigation into his gambling. And this will consume the entire season. It's going to devour the 1989 baseball season. And I remember as a fan feeling every emotion that season about Pete Rose. At the outset, I remember thinking the same thing most people thought. There's no way. There's no way. I mean, even Faye Vincent, the deputy commissioner of baseball who I interviewed, said the same thing. There's no way. But by the end of that summer, objectively, as a 16-year-old, I remember reading the Dowd report and reading the stories and thinking, oh my God, he totally did it and he's lying. So again, I'm not part of any of that. I mean, I think no one wanted to believe it. And that's the thing. In the last 35 years, while Pete Rose has been banned from baseball and he sort of made mistake after mistake off the field, I think we forgot why we ever cared about him in the first place. And the other thing I think we forgot is in 1989, this was bad for baseball. This was not like some kind of, witch hunt to bring down Pete Rose. Bart Giamatti didn't have a vendetta against Pete Rose. This was all bad for baseball. It is, again, objectively speaking, one of the greatest, sports scandals of the 20th century.
So it absolutely, and it's cool to have you kind of bring it back and put it into the forefront and remind us on a week removed from OJ, finally expiring. It's one of those type deals, it's it's a tragedy, a Shakespearean tragedy, right? As Dan Rather called it with O.J. Simpson. So we want to talk about Pete Rose talking to you. Now, you talked to him until you didn't. Well, did Pete Rose ghost you? Is that what I'm taking away from this? Did you get ghosted?
Pete Rose did ghost me, yes, to use the term the kids use, yeah. And I will say he's done this before. What he's doing to me right now or has done to me isn't new. I'm not the only person he's ever done this to. I was just back in Cincinnati recently on my book tour, and I had an event on the west side of Cincinnati, which is the more working class part of town where Pete Rose is from. And in my signing line, a woman told me, "I think Pete Rose just gave you the West Side Irish goodbye." And he's done this before. He's done this to reporters. He's done this to beat writers. He's done this to friends. He's done this to girlfriends, mistresses, lovers. So I'm right in there with the others. And I don't know why. I mean, I just as I can't say why Pete Rose did talk to me to start with, I don't know why he stopped talking to me. But we could speculate about that if you want. If you want, Pete.
We got 27 hours of you talking to Pete, and that's all included in this book, along with all the other firsthand accounts. How many people did you talk to? Ballpark.
Over 100. So in some of these interviews weren't even on the record. It was just background, someone directing me to someone or something else, or shining some light on something. So there were, there are 160 hours of on the record interviews, and then just a ton other stuff. So yeah,
Johnny Bench apparently had a conversation with Kurt Gowdy. This is, I think, around the time of the '76 World Series, which they won, and it was brought up. The comment was made, hey, he's hanging out with, quote, bad guys. That's what Gowdy remembers from the conversation, those words. Take us into that underbelly. Pete Rose was surrounded by shady people. It was a sordid world.
Yeah. Yeah. So by 75, 76, P. Rose's gambling is pretty much an open secret in the Reds clubhouse. And he's been betting with bookies on the west side of Cincinnati for at least a handful of years now. Not betting on baseball, but betting on football, basketball, etc. And what's really notable, Pete, is in the 1975 World Series, that epic World Series with the Red Sox and the Reds, there's a man inside the Reds clubhouse by the invitation of Sparky Anderson, the manager of the team, and also Pete Rose. And that man's name was Mario Nunez. And Pete called him the Cuban. And Mario Nunez was a much older man than Pete, and he was well connected in gambling circles. Mario Nunez, the Cuban, was the maitre d' at Tampa Downs in the clubhouse there at the racetrack in Tampa, where the Reds had spring training. And I do think it's really interesting and notable that during the 75 World Series, the Cuban has intimate access to the clubhouse, to the locker room. And I don't know if that who Bench was referring to when he said that Rose was hanging around with bad guys. But I do think it's curious. I do think it's interesting. Mario Nunez would have been a man who had knowledge of where to get down bets, and it's clear that Pete is betting during the 75 World Series. And I want to be clear, not necessarily on the Reds. There's a 3-day rain delay in Boston, and Rose is bouncing off the walls. This man is full of energy today. He was full of energy then. He's bouncing off the walls at the Howard Johnson in downtown Boston. And he's fixated on the fact that the game 7 might land on Monday night. And he doesn't want it to land on Monday night because that's Monday Night Football. And
you say in the book he wanted to watch Buffalo and the Jets play.
He says it to the press. Yes.
Yeah, so that kind of gives – I thought the same exact thing I listened to the book. And I was like, wow, this is totally – you know what that's about, the Monday Night Football. And that was a special night for everybody, just like the World Series was that year. Game 7, 75 million people are watching. The Reds are incredible, right? I mean, you go down the list. As a guy who grew up as a baseball fan, Johnny Bench, Dave Concepcion, Tony Perez, George Foster, Joe Morgan, the names just jump out at you. And they all became part of the fabric that was baseball society. But a guy like Bench talks about some of these suspect figures. And before they win the World Series, Pete wins the MVP. I think it was 74?
73.
73. I wanted to ask you this, and this is me asking you in your opinion. Is that when things started to jump off a little bit with him, like almost like drunk on his own power? Because it seems like things start to get weird, in my opinion. He starts to, the reporting that you've done is he's with a girl who was 14 years old, and they have a relationship while he's married. The whole thing is really, for me, that's tougher than the gambling.
Well, right. So to be clear, we don't know how old she was. There is dispute about that. Pete says he believes she was 16. In court papers filed a few.
And that was the legal age in
correct.
Ohio.
That was the legal age of consent in Ohio. The girl said she believes she was younger. There is no resolution on that. There may never be any resolution on that. What is clear is, he's having a relationship with a high school girl in Cincinnati in the mid-1970s, right about the time he wins the MVP. They go to the World Series. They win the World Series in 75. All of this stuff is happening at the same time. And, it's part of the book and part of the narrative, not because it's salacious or sensational, but because I do think it exemplifies just how much Pete was unraveling off the field when he was having his greatest success on it. And I think that is incredibly notable. In interviews I did with lots of former major leaguers, his cohorts, his colleagues, the guys he played with and against, they all told me that they would bring their problems to work just like everybody else. If you're having marital problems, you're having financial trouble, you're drinking too much, you bring it to work, And Pete Rose wasn't like that at all. In 78, a few years after the story we were just talking about, we've got these off-field affairs. He's got a mistress who's now pregnant with his child secretly. Swirling rumors of his gambling. That's the season when he goes on the 44-game hit streak, the longest streak we've seen in 82 years. So, it's even guys.
That is like cyborg type stuff.
Yeah, right. And I think this also captures part of the tragedy of the story. Not everybody who's great at sports loves the sport they play. They might just be great at it, and it's an avenue to make money and earn fame and then do other things that they really love, like play golf or go fishing or travel or whatever. Pete Rose loved baseball. He loved it. He loved going to the ballpark. He loved being at the batting cage. He loved taking batting practice. He loved taking extra batting practice. He loved the banter in the clubhouse. He loved the competition he loved the whole thing. And so, when he walked into that stadium, he could, shed all of his problems and do his thing and then move on with his life. And the reason why I mentioned I think that's tragic is obviously he's lost access to that for 35 years, and we're skipping ahead a little bit, but, he talks to me about that in my reporting. And, there are lots of things, of course, that bug him about that. Obviously, there's the Hall of Fame issue. Obviously, there's the money he lost, and he did lose a lot of money by not being a major league manager for, say, another 20 seasons. But what he lost most of all was that access to the thing he loved. And you can't put a number on that.
How come it took him so long to come clean?
Yeah, so that was one key question I had, because when you get inside the story like I did, you see, especially in 1989, the year of the investigation, there's a couple of turning points where he could have said it, could have come clean, and it would have been different if he had. And I think there are two reasons why he couldn't do it then, and these two reasons apply for why he couldn't do it for another 15 years. First, I think the same things that made Pete a success as a player are the same things that doom him to failure as a person, which I think is a really interesting thing to think about, that our greatest qualities could also be our greatest weaknesses. On the field, he plays with fury. He won't be vulnerable. He will not bend to anyone. He believes at all times that he will beat you. And that's really good for a ball player, a hitter especially, right? Off the field, those same qualities. He's not going to bend. He's not going to be vulnerable. He believes until the very end he will beat you. Or why he can't be honest in 89. He thinks he's going to get out of it. I think the other thing is something that he struggles to admit. And that is Pete Rose was addicted to gambling in the 1980s. He was an addict. And, what does an addict do when confronted by employers, friends, and loved ones about the problem, right? We know they deny, diminish, evade. And Pete does that. But I think there's something specific to gambling addicts. And I've done a lot of research about this. And this isn't really part of the book, but I wanted to understand. And there's a growing amount of medical research about gambling addiction because there are more and more of them today. Not just in America, but in England and other places where gambling has been legalized. So there's a boon, really, of research on this topic. And what comes up again and again about gambling addicts specifically is that there are two things that prevents them from coming clean about their problem, about seeking help or admitting the truth. And the first is shame, and the second is indebtedness, being in debt. And, Pete Rose would never admit to feeling shame. He can't do that. But I can tell you definitively, in the 1980s, he is in debt to bookies. At times, those debts are enormous. And I do think he feels shame about that, even if he's unwilling to admit that.
Yeah, and that's the difference, too, with today's ball players. Why, and this is my opinion, why they're so hard to get to, because they make so much money. Like back then, if you're indebted to a bookie for $200,000, that's a shitload of money, and it's how am I going to figure this out? I appreciate you shining the light too on the addict part. That's super interesting because I think a lot of people don't even bother with that really. What was the most you know Pete Rose, you know the Reds. What was the most shocking? And this story had been told in many different ways, but you have extra court documents, you have extra research, you have brand new information that's brought to light in your book, Charlie Hustle. What was the thing for you as a fan and a writer that was the most shocking taking away?
Oh my gosh. So many incredible finds and surprises and things I didn't expect. It'd be hard to list them, but I will give you a straight answer. You know, in in the previous tellings of this story, it's just like, oh yeah, Rose has a problem, and there's some beef with some guys in his inner circle, and they turn on each other, and Rose goes down. And that's part of the story, you know? But what was really key to telling sort of the last, sort of two acts of the book, the fall and the wreckage sections of the book, is federal court documents. Just as there is currently in Los Angeles a federal investigation into Shohei Ohtani's now former interpreter. There were federal investigations starting around 1986, 87 into Pete Rose's guys. Some of these guys were on the outskirts of his inner circle. Some of them were square in the middle of it. And all of
These
them.
are guys like, drug addicts, right? Like cocaine guys, like
Well, yeah.
and they're involved in that trade. And this is a real underbelly.
Some of them are distributing cocaine, selling cocaine. Some of them are distributing and selling steroids. And then you have all the money flying hither and yon to the bookie and bookies. And so one thing I did was, go in search of those federal court documents about all of these men. And there's over a dozen of them, really. And some of them, again, are pretty tangential to Pete, but it's like once you see one get picked off and then the next one get picked off, they start to turn on each other. And I went to the federal courthouse in Ohio, several of them. I ultimately figured out where those records were. I ordered them back from the federal court repository. They came in large boxes. I had to go into the Columbus, Ohio federal courthouse for like 4 days and scan these documents. And what's so crucial about it is, it shows at times with courtroom testimony, just how the walls are closing in around Pete Rose. And it's not happening 3 weeks before, the first meeting about gambling in 1980. Not even happening 3 months. It's happening like 3 years before. And so you can really paint this picture of Pete Rose is just set the all-time hit record. And Pete Rose is at the peak, really, of his iconic status, almost like an elder statesman of American sports. And meanwhile, the walls are literally closing in around him.
Yeah, I remember as a kid, right? I don't know if that game was on TBS but that game was on national TV. It was a weeknight, and it wasn't like a game of the week or a World Series. And at the time, it was such a huge deal, him breaking that record. And you mentioned it. That's an amazing way to put it because he was at such a high. Here's a couple more things for you.
Yeah.
I wrote these down. Oh, I got one small one and then one more big one, and then I'll let you out of here. What kind of teammate was Pete Rose, in your opinion?
In the interviews I did with people, obviously there's a difference of opinion. Not everybody likes everybody in a clubhouse. It's like not everybody likes anybody wherever they work. But universally, the prevailing thought was, if Pete Rose was on your team, that was a good thing, and you liked it. And when he wasn't on your team, you absolutely hated it. Because he played with a fury that would usually benefit the team. And so, by and large, he was a beloved teammate. And not just by the fellow stars, but by, the guys at the end of the bench. I remember an interview with Larry Boa. You'll remember Larry Boa as a Philly fan. Many of your viewers and listeners will too. Larry Boa is a star with the Phillies when Pete joins the team there in 1979. And the Phillies have been really good for years. They're knocking on the door of the World Series. They just can't get in. And Rose is sort of hoped to be the key missing piece, on a team that has Steve Carlton and Larry Boa and Manny Trio and obviously Mike Schmidt. And Boa told me a story from that first season, 1979. They're struggling. The Phillies struggled in 79. Pete did great, but the Phillies struggled. And Boa said he would be leaving the game, Old Veterans Stadium, at the end of the night. It's 10:30. And he would hear the machine in the inside batting cage, wonk, whack, wonk, whack. And he said he would go down there, and who's sitting there swinging by himself? Pete Rose. And Boa said that just even that was like motivation. If Pete Rose, then at that time it was already going to be a future Hall of Famer. He's got 3,000 hits. He's an all-timer. It could be swinging in the batting cage at 10:30 at night after a win or a loss, then maybe Boa said they should all be working harder.
Yeah, that's a great answer. Last one, you wrote an article recently about the Ohtani betting scandal for The Athletic. You do a lot of writing everywhere, Athletic. One of the publications, you said it won't be the last, or at least the headline said it. I don't know if you wrote the headline, but what are your thoughts on that? Do you feel like this is something that could happen again? Because just like the guy Nunez you write about in your book from Tampa, Ohtani's interpreter had full access to the clubhouse. And I don't care what you say. I've worked in sports. I've been around it. You pick up nuggets and all kinds of inside information. What do you think about that going forward? Is that something that could happen again?
In one of my very first interviews I did for the book, which is almost now 2.5 years ago, it was with Fay Vincent, the former deputy commissioner under Bart Giamatti in 1989, and then ultimately commissioner of baseball. And Fay Vincent is one of the most intelligent men I've ever interviewed. Not in this book, anything. And he told me in one of our very first interviews that there's going to be more Pete Roses and there's going to be more corruption. It's only a matter of time. And he said that because he was looking out over the landscape of all the changes of gambling in America. And, I'll be honest, I have legal gambling apps on my phone. And if I'm with a pal, especially a buddy, and we're watching a game together, a big game, yeah, it might be entertaining to put $10 or $20 on it collectively. As Pete Rose once said, it's more entertaining if you got a little action on it. But it's dangerous. And, it clearly is addictive. Gambling is a known addictive product. And I mean, look at the details just recently in the federal court filing for Shohei Ohtani's former interpreter. Talking about a guy who allegedly, in a span of 26 months, placed 19,000 bets and lost $180 million. These guys know they can't do it on their phones. They can't be like you and me. They can't do it on their phones. There are security companies that have been contracted and hired by the leagues to monitor betting on all the legal platforms. And they can trace it straight to our phone in a matter of minutes. And I mean, that's you and I too. If I typically, place, say, one $10 bet a month, and tonight I'm down in Boston at the Celtics game, and I place a $10,000 bet on the Celtics to lose, it's flagged immediately. That's odd. I don't bet like that. Well, the same thing's true for players. So they're not going to be doing this on their phones. They're going to catch that right away. What I think is going to happen, and has, allegedly already happened with a man who was an employee of the Angels and the Dodgers, is they're going to be placing bets with illegal bookmakers, the kind of bookies that Pete Rose and his guys placed bets with 35, 40 years ago. And, that business remains strong. Based on the most recent estimates, it's a still $60 billion a year industry. The illegal bookmaking. Illegal bookmaking, $60 billion. And, we're talking about guys who have lots of disposable cash, lots of free time, and an innate desire to compete. And I think when you throw all those three things together and you throw in our wide embrace now of gambling in America, I do think Fay Vincent was right. I do think we will see more scandals across all of our sports.
All right, the book is Charlie Hustle, Keith O'Brien, New York Times bestselling author. We appreciate you so much for spending the time with me today. I can legitimately say I'm working on the second half of the book. I'm loving it. I'm devouring it, so I appreciate it. I appreciate guys like you writing books for people like me. That's how I see it, at least.
I love that, Pete. I had a blast talking to you, man. Thanks for having me.
All right, brother. Take care, man. I appreciate it, Keith. All right, Jake Fischer, Yahoo Sports, No Cap Room is the podcast he does with Dan Devine. It's something if you're an NBA fan or even just a fan that's on the fringes, you got to listen to. And Built to Lose. As a Sixers fan, I don't know how I feel about this. How the NBA's tanking era changed the league forever. A great book, obviously, the subject in the title. Thank you so much for taking the time today, Jake.
You got it. Thanks for having me.
Okay, I got to ask you off the top, because I want to talk a little Sixers, and with your book, Built to Lose. The tanking situation in Philadelphia, this is kind of broad, not as topical, but the tanking situation in Philadelphia with Sam Hinkie and ultimately Daryl Morey, maybe not so much, has that affected the team and their overall ability to win a championship and build a winning culture?
You know, I was just talking to someone yesterday who was an assistant coach on that staff dating back to the very beginning of the Brett Brown tenure in 2013. And Philly really did think they had the best team in the Eastern Conference in 2019 when those Kawhi 4 bounces at the buzzer in Game 7 in Toronto ended up sending the Raptors ahead and they win the title. And, like, to me, I think the Kevin Durant toeing the line in Brooklyn, you know, KD then, or even before all that, in Brooklyn, KD tearing his Achilles that led to the Raptors title. Like, the championship is so hard to guarantee. And the one through line through all these teams that have done it throughout the years, you get star talent, you get top 5 MVP caliber players, and you just need to hope that the luck and all the other intangibles end up breaking your way. So the fact that whatever you want to call it, whether it was 2013 to 2016 Hinkie's tenure, that's the process. If it's still going on now, the fact that they have Joel Embiid, who's been an MVP, who's been a top 3 finisher in MVP multiple times, who's taken them to the playoffs every single year, even though they haven't gotten out of the second round, I still think it's in general a success because anything beyond that is it's not guaranteed in this league. There's too many stuff that comes up with injuries and certain whistles and what have you that's out of your control. And the real goal of tanking and of the process is just to get as many bites of the apple and swings and darts at the dartboard of those top 5 type talents. And they have at least one. They've got Tyrese Maxey to show for it. The Ben Simmons tree that turns to James Harden that's given them these 3 picks in this cap space now. Like, there's still optionality to improve, but having Embiid to me is enough of a success.
So we talk about Embiid now. He's coming back from injury, obviously not 100%. When we talk about the Sixers in the playoffs, will Nick Nurse maybe help this team get to another level as far as the postseason is concerned, like his experience? Because I still look at the Sixers. This is not – I don't think they're as talented, right, obviously, as they were last year without James Harden. And maybe you're the expert. You'll tell me if I'm wrong. But I don't see them as talented, and I see them as much more of a long shot, especially with the playing game and all those things being considered. How are they looking heading into the postseason this year?
They're definitely not as talented, but I do think they're a little bit deeper. That depth will have a little bit of an issue if Anthony Melton can't come back from injury and Robert Covington can't come back from injury, which does seem to be the case. So that point is a little bit moot, but in theory, on paper and healthy, I think this team is a little bit deeper in the 5 through 8. But at this point in time, really the only thing that matters is Joel's ability to be on the floor, and he seems to be a full go. So with Nick Nurse at his disposal, I mean, last year I remember being in Phoenix, ready for Game 6 of Denver and Phoenix the same night, and I was in the media room in the Suns Arena with a couple of scouts watching Game 7 in Boston between Philly and the Celtics, and to see how much of a struggle it was for the Sixers to just get Joel the ball compared to how Jokic just caught it off the glass on a defensive board and took it up the floor, and he could touch it in all different places. I think that aspect, just being able to put your best player in a position to make a decision and to have the game have an outcome based off of what he does, Nick Nurse will absolutely be, I think, better served for Philadelphia to do that compared to what Doc Rivers was. So
well, now you mentioned Doc, and I'm curious your thoughts now as we transition to the Bucks. Giannis may or may not play early in the series. You probably, again, you're the expert. You probably have insight on that. Doc Rivers is the, I guess the shine is gone if you're a Sixers fan, right? So it's hard for me to be objective. But for you, as an NBA beat writer, is he in a position where he can find a way to put the pieces together and take this team to the finals and possibly win another championship?
It's going to be really hard if Giannis isn't healthy. And right now, it does not seem optimistic in Milwaukee that he's going to be at full strength, let alone if he plays at all. So it's going to be a massive uphill battle against an Indiana team that's already had success against the Bucks this season, most notably in that in-season tournament semifinal game in Las Vegas that I was at, where they had Malik Beasley shadowing Tyrese Halliburton around the floor. Like, it's going to be an absolute battle. And I think the bigger question for Milwaukee is not if Doc Rivers can help them win a title. It's if they can even get out of the first round. And if that doesn't happen, what comes next? Like, we already saw Giannis flirting with not signing an extension, and Damian Lillard's situation, he already asked out of Portland. Like, so there's going to be a lot more questions that come from Milwaukee, I think, if they don't advance deep in this playoffs compared to just, all right, is Mike Budenholzer really the guy that we saw last year?
So let's go to New York. You're based out of Brooklyn, so I'm sure you get to see the Knicks pretty much whenever you want. How
Sunday,
yeah. This is exciting. Like I'm like I mentioned, Sixers fan first, but I'm an NBA guy second. And when the Knicks are playing well, it's so exciting. I used to work in the NBA, and I did PR for the Sixers. And at the time, the Knicks really sucked. This is like, and I worked for the Bobcats too before they were the Hornets. And New York was never good. It was Larry Brown and then Isaiah Thomas, and it was a bummer. And even 2013, I guess, like that was so exciting with Carmelo, and they were able to win the Atlantic Division. But this really seems like we've got something real here. For you, who has an up-close look at this situation and this team, are we being delusional with hoping they can make a run, or can Jalen Brunson put it together and sort of pioneer a winning ship in the postseason?
I mean, they're going to have a difficult path to do it with either Miami or Philly. But if they do, which I'm confident with, Jalen Brunson, to me, the league offered me a vote. I bluntly declined. I don't want to get involved in all the supermax ramifications, all that type of stuff. But I would have Jalen Brunson top 3 on my ballot behind Nikola Jokic and Shai Gilgeous-Alexander. I would. I mean, what he's done this season, scoring 40, 11 times and averaging 28 and 6 on 40% three-point shooting. He played 77 games. Like, those are Larry Bird, Steph Curry type numbers. They're the only 2 guys to ever do that. And they both won MVP in those seasons. 85 for Bird and 2016 for Steph. And behind Brunson, they've got dudes who want to run and defend for him. His college teammates and Josh Hart and Dante DiVincenzo, but other guys like Isaiah Hartenstein, and even, Precious Achiuwa in that overtime against Chicago on Sunday is switching out onto DeMar DeRozan and doing a good job on him. They just have dogs and dudes and hustlers, and they're a gritty team that's in the image of Tom Thibodeau and Jalen Brunson. I think as long as the shots continue to fall for him and for Dante, they get some real dynamic ball handling from Bojan Bogdanovic off the bench. That's the key for New York to me. It's those 3 or 4 minutes that Jalen Brunson's not going to play. Is the Deuce McBride, Alec Burks, Bojan Bogdanovic, is that collection of guys going to be enough to uphold those minutes it was against Chicago on Sunday. I'm curious if it will continue to be moving forward.
People will be watching because it's, you know, the number one market in the country, and there is a lot of excitement around this team. At least I'll be watching. I gotta bring you back. You mentioned, because I know you've talked about it on your podcast, Ball Don't Lie, about having the opportunity to vote for the MVP, but turning it down. For folks who don't hear your podcast all the time, what's the thinking behind that?
I think for what I do, you know, I'm a feature writer, I'm a podcast host, but I also have to cover the transactional sides of things with the trade deadline and the drafting for agency. And a lot of that, you know, dabbling in that information requires some already kind of gray area with relationships with agents and coaches and executives and whatnot. And the fact that my vote could, in theory, help trigger that Supermax rule where all of a sudden, you know, if Paolo Banchero makes All NBA this year and next year, he's impacting, you know, he gets now an extra 35 or extra 5% of the cap, and it impacts Orlando's salary structure moving forward. That type of stuff to me is just a little thorny. You know, John Morant missed out on $40 extra million last year for all his stuff, and Jason Tatum missed out on $40 extra million, you know, a couple of years ago. I don't want to be involved in something that's going to have impact on a player's salary and a team's overall cap sheet.
What is it like covering the NBA day to day in a world that's post-COVID and where accessibility was sort of stripped and then obviously reissued, and that's all way beyond us, right? That's medical. That was what it was. But even now, you mentioned you being a feature writer for Yahoo. These guys have their own platforms. These guys don't necessarily need, or at least that's what the philosophical approach is. They don't need writers and media outlets like they did before. How much more difficult has that made your job?
You know, it's not apples and oranges. It is apples and oranges. What I meant to say, like there are certain teams where their PR department is wonderful, and I tell Orlando I want to sit down with Paolo Banchero last week when I was in Charlotte, and I get him for 20 minutes, and he's great. And then I walk over to Franz Wagner post game, and we've got a story. But like Nikola Jokic, to get 5 minutes with him was like pulling teeth, you know?
Yeah.
And it's certain agencies are better than others, and depends on certain things. So I don't know. I think my day to day, it depends on the time of year. You know, between December 15th and February 8th, I'm on the phone all day from 10 a.m. till when I finally go to sleep, was trying to figure out what's happening on the trade market. And I get tired of badgering executives and agents and all those people. And then for the last 2 months, it's been fun to talk to players and be in the locker room and kind of get in that whole world and broker that access. But now I am a little tired of waiting till 11 p.m. on a Monday night after a game just to get my 7 minutes with an all-star. And I am looking forward a bit to the off-season stuff and covering the playoff games and whatnot. So it really is, like, every day is different. And the access really depends on the player, the team, the agency. It's all kind of fluid.
So we talk about some of the stars that are in the playoffs or in the postseason as we stand today. A lot of them are towards the bottom of the bracket or the seedings. Which star do you think has the best opportunity to take their team, like similar to what LeBron was able to do last year with the Lakers, to take them to the brink against the Nuggets? Or does Steph have that in his tank, or can Jimmy Butler possibly do that? Could it be Embiid? If you had to pick one, or maybe somebody I left out, who would that be?
I do kind of like the Warriors' path being that, but the Thunder are the top seed in the West. They've been there all year long. But the fact that they have never been in a real playoff scenario, they've had some play-in experience. And I trust Shea, having helped lead Canada to the gold medal in the World Cup. I was there in Manila this summer. I think Mark Dagnall is one of the hands down best coaches in the NBA. Just got named the coach of the year based off of the Coaches Association, which is voted by his peers. I think that guy is as brilliant as they come, but it is a different beast 1 through 17 on the roster and through your whole coaching staff being in it and being in a chess match. And the Warriors have done that, and they just won the title 2 years ago. I think that's a very interesting path if Golden State is able to make it into that 8 seed and take all that experience. I mean, it's a styles make fights perfect for the billboard, the 4-time aging champion versus the young potential budding dynasty. It would be a pretty fascinating series to watch.
A couple things before I let you go as we think about the offseason. And some people are already there. Some teams are already there. What do you think could be the biggest shift in the league this offseason that in your crystal ball you foresee possibly happening?
We were talking about it earlier. Like Milwaukee right now, man, if things don't go well, we've talked, I mean, people have mentioned Zion and, Zach LaVine was a name at the trade deadline, and Joel Embiid is a name that the Knicks are always going to be associated with, Donovan Mitchell in Cleveland. But all these teams are looking at Giannis. And another Bucks first-round loss, which, again, he might not play in the first couple games. He might not play at all, even though he wouldn't. Let's pull out that hypothetical. Even if he doesn't play, and in theory, like, it's technically on his shoulders as much as anyone that they didn't get out of the first round. He took to the New York Times and a podcast. He was very, very public with the fact that he only wanted to stay in Milwaukee long-term if he thought that there was a chance to win there. 2 straight years of a first-round exit would be just an absolute total wild card scenario for what would happen for his future. And any team in a big market with cap space or draft picks or what have you is going to open their pocketbook and try to get into that sweepstakes if that happens. Again, major if, but that would be if you're looking for the potential biggest thing of the offseason, it's that.
If there was a possible landing spot, a big market team, who would that be?
I mean, New York would be right there. Brooklyn would be right there. The Warriors will absolutely try if they even see a possible pathway to get there. Yeah, it'll be. I mean, Miami will always try to be a team for Giannis. You can kind of just think of a team, and they will be there.
Who is what coaching change do you think could be the biggest? What coaching name could we see on the move this summer?
In terms of like the biggest name that could be out that's currently there now?
Or the biggest name that could be going somewhere else? Either or. The biggest coaching change.
Ty Lue was absolutely at the top of Phoenix's list last year. He was at the top of Milwaukee's list last year. The Clippers guaranteed his contract for next season, 2024-2025. But there's a ton of question marks about the Clippers' future too. Kawhi Leonard signed to a 3-year extension. He's the only one that is guaranteed to be at the Intuit Dome next year. I think that probably makes some sense for James Harden too. There doesn't seem to be a ton of opportunity for him to get the money he wants outside of LA. But if they lose, and they've got a really tough task with Dallas. Does Paul George look elsewhere with the flirtation from Philly and potentially other places? And does that end up impacting Ty Lue? I think it's really, really plausible because he's someone who, based off of the industry information, is looking to fancy himself along the lines of the Steve Kerr, Eric Spoelstra, $17-18 million. There aren't many teams that are going to be willing to pay that, and I'd be curious if the Clippers are one of them if this team doesn't get out of the first round themselves.
All right, Jake Fischer. I wish we had more time, dude. I appreciate you chatting with me this afternoon. The book is Built to Lose, and the podcast, Ball Don't Lie. Jake, you are the man, and I really appreciate you taking the time.
Appreciate you and all the kind words, man. Thank you.
All right, brother. Take it easy. Wrapping things up with Jake Fischer, and we get set to close this afternoon or this evening or this morning, whenever you're listening, or maybe this overnight. Blake Griffin retires.
Mm-hmm.
This is we're a podcast. It's not up right away, but this happened just moments ago. Memories of Blake Griffin.
I think when we brought it up, I made the joke kind of, but it was
we're bringing it up now.
It was dunking over the kid.
We didn't prepare this.
Yeah. Oh, sorry. Wow. It's very interesting you brought that up. I didn't see that before. But dunking over the Kia is one thing, obviously, that I think of from the slam dunk contest. For some reason, I think of him in those Lob City teams, of him and Chris Paul and DeAndre Jordan. As a Rockets fan at that time, they ran into, or I'm always a Rockets fan, but they ran into those Clippers teams a lot. in the playoffs. And I don't, nothing against Blake Griffin, but for some reason when I think of him, I think of teams that
almost got there, but didn't.
never did.
100%.
Exactly.
Yeah, I he was a huge part of that team. Another nerding out sports doc situation for me with the Ramona Shelburne. There's a great audio podcast about the Donald Sterling affair, basically. In I don't know, it might even be called that. But Blake Griffin was a real lighthouse in a total crap storm for the Clippers at the time. And let's see, he averaged 24 points a game in 2013, 2014. That's the year we're talking about. And he averaged 24.5 points with Detroit.
Yeah.
Wow.
I forgot he was like, he still produced
in 75 games. Wow.
And then I think the stretches kind of towards the end were there with the Nets and with the Celtics that I remember.
Yeah, it's almost like he was with Brooklyn in 2021. I don't know if you'd call it ring chasing, but I think he was surrounded by really good players, right? Kyrie and
I think KD was on that.
Yeah, but Blake Griffin he brought us so much joy. Those Lob City teams, man.
I still remember covering him the 1 year at Oklahoma when he would come. I think the one game he came here to play Baylor and sitting there, and he was even dominating at Oklahoma.
He played 1 year in college?
I think it was just the 1 year at Oklahoma.
Okay.
But I remember like everybody. He was, the talk of the town when he came in there. But watching him in college, watching him in the pros, I always, throw that out there.
Let's see. I'm gonna check. I'm gonna double check you. By the way, he played 2 years.
Did he really play 2?
I had a vibe.
Okay, KD played 1. I do know. I'm not on that one.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I'm sorry. I forgot about the second year. I remember his last year before he went to the draft is the game that I came when he came here to Waco.
Yeah, and they went to the Elite Eight. He was Big 12 Player of the Year. I mean, I remember the Elite Eight. I didn't remember he was Big 12 Player of the Year. But Blake Griffin riding off into the sunset. By the way, now that's a guy. What will he do next?
Oh, for
he
sure.
is incredible personality, and the reason I know that is because there was one of those Comedy Central roasts that I saw, and he was hilarious. And I know that I heard Nikki Glazer was on the Howard Stern show, and I remember she said like he was just so cool to work with at one of those roasts.
He was on Caitlyn Jenner's.
The Caitlyn Jenner roast, okay, yeah. And that's all. We'll talk about that. But, yeah, pretty interesting stuff. We'll be back next week. And we somehow found a way to talk about O.J. Simpson and Caitlyn Jenner in the same show. I mean, that's taking me back to being a kid and also taking you out to, like, Brentwood and Hollywood and all that stuff. Brentwood is where O.J. lived.
Oh, yeah, okay.
All right. We'll see you next week. Thanks so much.
We are Rogue Media Sports.